we've spent the last couple of lectures in the company of the Romans during the heyday of their empire, but now it's time to visit them again in considerably less rosy times. This is not the place to go into the complexities of the decline and eventual collapse of the Western Roman Empire. There's far too much involved in that. However, we have to talk about this time period to see what that collapse of Western Roman civilization meant for the history of science and the history of technology. We're going to look at what happened to scientific knowledge, whether episteme or techne, that is speculative knowledge, theoretical knowledge about the natural world, or crafts, in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, during the collapse of governmental administration in the West, social order, and the invasion and ultimate occupation of Roman lands by external forces, the barbarians, as they are often called. Well, the first factor to consider is the progressive segregation of the Western Latin world from the Eastern Greek world. In the heyday of the empire, as I mentioned in the last lecture, any well-educated Romans with pretensions to being part of the ruling class was bilingual, Greek and Latin. Well, from the 2nd to the 5th century AD, the knowledge of Greek language and culture in Roman lands in the West diminished. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, in the early days of the empire, the Latins, the Romans, were captivated by the level and the beauty of Greek culture, aesthetically and in other senses. They found something in the Greek world that they didn't have themselves. But over time, as the Roman culture developed, native Latin artistic and other works were produced. It developed, the Latin tradition developed in and of itself, and so the aristocracy, in a sense, didn't need to keep going to the Greeks. The Greek knowledge was assimilated, native Latin culture developed in different ways, and so the aristocracy and its tastes changed. The fashionability for a smattering of Greek learning waned. Now, sort of to cap off this growing separation between Latin and Greek halves of the empire was eventually, first partially at the end of the 3rd and then finally at the beginning of the 4th century, administratively divided between two capitals, Rome and Constantinople. This divided Western Europe, Latin Europe, what from now on I will call the Latin West, even further from the sources and the traditions of Greek learning, Greek natural philosophy in the East. So that means that when this is combined, when this decrease in the ability to deal with Greek knowledge, the decrease in the interest in Greek knowledge is combined with the lack of Roman interest in theoretical and advanced natural philosophy, the loss of the knowledge of the Greek language meant that only the popularized Latin versions of Greek natural philosophy survived the fall of the empire and were passed on in Western Europe to the Middle Ages. These were not the original works of Greek antiquity, but rather popularized versions. So in a way, we can now begin to understand, if we see it in this context, the paucity of the information of antiquity that the Middle Ages had. The difference was the Romans, in their heyday, knew Greek. They had access to the Greek original texts if they had cared to avail themselves of it. By and large, they chose not to. The Middle Ages didn't have the opportunity to avail themselves of this Greek tradition. They only got what they had inherited from their immediate predecessor, the Roman Empire. Well, we can illustrate this by mentioning one character by the name of Boethius, who was born about 480 AD, was executed by the barbarian emperor Theodoric in 524 AD. He's often called the last bilingual philosopher of the Roman Empire. He certainly did know both Latin and Greek. He translated some of Aristotle's logical works, methodological works, and a few other Greek texts into Latin, thus preserving them for the Middle Ages, because they were in a language that the Middle Ages continued to use, Latin, not Greek. But Boethius showed very little interest in natural philosophical topics, so he didn't get much, Middle Ages, didn't get much from Greek antiquity via Boethius. Some Aristotle, not much. Well, we can't blame Boethius for this. He was a philosopher. He wasn't particularly interested in natural philosophy. He translated things that he thought were important and were of interest to him. The disintegration of administrative and organizational systems that characterized the stability of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and of the Roman Empire disintegrated as well under the assault of barbarian incursions. That meant that the maintenance of Roman technology, the great aqueducts, for example, that we saw, could not be maintained. One example is the silting up of the harbor for the city of Rome at Ostia. Roman farming practices were not particularly environmentally friendly, as we would say. They allowed for a great deal of runoff, of loss of topsoil, and so the Tiber tended to silt up very quickly. Harbors have to be dredged. By the 4th century, there was not sufficient administrative stability to take on projects of that magnitude, of cleaning out a harbor. So what happens? The harbor silts up more and more, and eventually the city of Rome is left without a good, workable, deep water for the period port. Similarly with the aqueducts. If you go today to the Pont du Gard and you look at the channel on the top of the aqueduct, you will see that there are these huge deposits of lime, of calcareous deposits lining the waterway, in some cases up to 1.5 feet thick. This is because the water was full of lime when it came out of the springs, and during its course it deposited this as a sediment on the sides of the aqueducts. Therefore, as you can imagine, the aqueducts require a great deal of maintenance to keep cleaning them out. Eventually, there was not the administrative, technological oversight to keep them clean, and they stopped functioning. Aqueducts tended to be used as bridges in the Middle Ages. Hence, they are often called nowadays puente this or pont that. They tend to be used just as bridges. Even the construction of large stone buildings could rarely be accomplished by the 6th century and afterwards. Knowledge of glass making and various sorts of ceramics that were important to the Roman luxury trade likewise dwindled away, with a concomitant loss of the technical knowledge necessary to keep those kind of industries functioning. Well, you think about it, it's a very logical thing. Let's say you're a glassmaker and your customers are aristocratic Romans. Well, as the aristocracy falls and doesn't have money anymore for these kind of luxury goods, you go out of business. What do you have to do? You become a farmer because your family has to eat. You do something else. Your trade, your techniques are not passed on to apprentices or children, and so they vanish. Even in the eastern half of the empire, the Greek half of the empire, the ancient schools and institutions that had been host to natural philosophy for centuries dwindled away or were closed. Plato's Academy, the Lyceum, closed probably in the 1st century BC. There were attempts to restart the Academy during the Christian era, but it was very short-lived. They did not succeed and were closed. One thing that is of enormous importance now, and will become only of greater importance as we move into the next set of lectures, is the rise of Christianity. Christianity introduced major new ways of thinking about the world to the old Roman culture, and to the remnants of Hellenistic culture as well in the East, of course. The relationship between young Christianity and the pagan world in which Christianity developed is extremely complex but extraordinarily important. I will not try to discuss it here in this lecture. We're going to devote the entire next lecture to that one topic of Christianity's relationship to the pagan world in the first years of the Christian religion. Extremely important because it sets the stage for at least the next 1,000, 1,500 years, and certainly up to the present day and into the future. At this point, the only thing I will do is to enumerate 3 characters who stand out from the declining Roman Empire from the 5th and 6th and early 7th century. All of them Christians, and all of them important in one way or another for setting the stage for the Middle Ages, which is our next destination. The first one of these is a man by the name of Cassiodorus. Cassiodorus was born in 485. All our dates are going to be AD from now. Born in 485, lived to the ripe old age of 95, died in the year 580. By the way, let me just, a small aside. We tend to make a lot nowadays of increasing longevity. And it's true. The average age of life now is twice what it was in the Middle Ages, or presumably in the Roman Empire. But if we restrict our view just to the people whom we know of, who scholars and people who lived a sort of better class of life, a better style of life, we see that even in the ancient period there were examples of octogenarians, nonagenarians, and even centenarians. It's just that now more people are living longer. So Cassiodorus lived to be 95. He was originally a civil servant and an officer under the Ostrogothic rulers. He, however, became disillusioned with government life. He retired from government life and returned to his villa. He was from a rather well-to-do family, a villa called the Vivarium in southern Italy, and set it up as a monastery. He himself was not a monk, but he was a leader of a monastic community that came together at the Vivarium. His expressed goal, and this is extremely important, was to preserve ancient learning, things that he saw that were of value and which he feared were imperiled. He wrote several works, one called the Institutiones, which is an encyclopedic style of work. It sort of mimics, it carries on that Roman encyclopedic style by enumerating the 7 liberal arts and arguing as to why they are important for Christians. Now, the educational system that the Romans set up, which I've mentioned to you already, gradually was filled with more and more Christians. Christian parents would send their Christian children to the pagan schools. It was the school that was available to them, much in the same way that in many places Catholic schools, for example, have a minority of Catholic students, expressly Catholic students, enrolled. It's a good educational system where people even outside the denomination will send their children for an education. The same thing was going on in the declining years of the Roman Empire. The pagan schools were still being attended by increasing numbers of Christian children. He wrote enthusiastically, Cassiodorus did, wrote enthusiastically about some of the technological inventions used at the Vivarium. For example, water clocks and sundials to mark out the period of time for prayer, for example. He talked about irrigation devices because apparently it was an attempt to make a more or less self-sufficient community, and so agriculture was important. There were apparently irrigation devices to help out in the fields. In fact, monastic centers become technological centers throughout the Middle Ages, places where technologies are preserved, are used, and are developed. And we'll see a lot of examples of that in the future lectures upcoming. Cassiodorus's monks spent their time doing a very important job, that is, copying selected works of antiquity. Now, not a great deal from natural philosophy because, again, they were heir to Roman ways of thinking. They didn't think about natural philosophy as being particularly important. They were, after all, Christian monks. More important issues were things in moral, biblical exegesis, this kind of thing, things that related to the spiritual life. But nonetheless, there were some bits of natural philosophy that did end up getting copied. But more important was the fact that they started this tradition of copying out texts and preserving them. In fact, already by this time, most of the works of the Greek theorists were out of their reach, linguistically, geographically, in all senses. I do want to read you one little passage from Cassiodorus. I think it's a beautiful passage. It's in one of his letters. It's a passage in praise of papyrus. He calls papyrus the snowy innards of a green plant, which can hold the sweet harvests of our minds and return it to the reader whenever he chooses. A beautiful line about papyrus, the writing material that Cassiodorus's monks used primarily. We haven't talked much about writing materials since we visited the Babylonians, who impressed their writing on clay tablets. But at this time, there were two major materials used for writing. One was papyrus. Papyrus is a reed that grows in the Nile Delta. The papyrus is taken, split open. The individual layers of the papyrus plant, like the rinds of an onion, are separated as long as you can get them, placed down on a wet board, first going one way, up and down, and then long ways at perpendicular 90-degree angles to the first set. Now, the papyrus material contains a mucilaginous sap in it, and that holds these various strips of the reed together into a flexible sheet. Our word paper comes from the word for papyrus. Now, what did they write on papyrus with? They wrote on it with a carbon-based ink, usually made out of lampblack, soot, in other words. It so happens, and it's very fortunate for us, that carbon black ink is very durable, and it happens to stick extremely well into the microscopic pores of papyrus. Papyrus is also fairly durable. Well, papyrus, remember, comes from Egypt. It was invented in Egypt for Egyptian conditions, i.e. dry. And papyrus lasts in dried conditions extremely well. There are papyri from from Egyptian tombs, 2,000, 3,000 years old, in excellent shape. It doesn't work so well in wetter climates. And so a second material, parchment, was used, which is animal skins. Now, people have been writing on animal skins since prehistoric times. But the development of parchment that's important is a Greek development that happened, according to the story, at Pergamon, where the animal skins were first wiped with lime, calcium hydroxide, folded together and left under water for a few days, which causes the hair to fall out. So you get a smooth surface that's stretched on a board and dried and treated a little bit more, and you get a flexible bit of parchment. Anyway, we should mention this because the maintenance of our culture is dependent upon our technology of writing, the writing materials that we put our words down upon, the inks that we use to record our thoughts. And Cassiodorus's line that I just read out to you is a beautiful expression of the importance of writing materials, the kinds of things Cassiodorus was trying to do. Well, let's move from Cassiodorus now to the second character I wanted to mention, and this is St. Benedict of Norcia. Nowadays, the town is called Norcia, Nursia, at Benedict's time. He was a little bit older, 5 years older than Cassiodorus, being born in 480, and he died in 547. Now, Benedict is known as the father of Western monasticism. We don't have time to go back through the entire history of monasticism within the Christian tradition, but in the West, certainly, Benedict, in founding the order of the Benedictines, is in fact the primary crafter of the monastic tradition in Western Christianity. Why are the Benedictines important? Well, let's talk about Benedict and his founding of the order briefly. He retired to a hermitage in the hills outside of Rome. He found that many people trying to improve their lives, find spiritual counsel, spiritual peace, came to visit him often, set up places to live near him. And so in order to regulate these societies or to help them develop, he wrote the regula, namely the rule. The rule, the Benedictine rule, stipulates what a monk does in a monastic community, what his duties are, how the community is governed. Remember, it's a communal society, so there have to be rules about how it's governed. And it also stipulates, and here's the important part for science and technology, not only hours of prayer, not only hours of manual work, usually 4 to 6 hours of prayer, 5 hours of manual work, but about 4 hours of what is called the Lectio Divina, the divine reading, reading of spiritually, morally useful texts. And I emphasize the word texts because that means that to be a Benedictine means to be literate, means to have a library, means to read and to write. The early Benedictines did not pursue scholarly aims, but it wasn't long before the copying and preservation of texts, which was championed by Cassiodorus, extended itself to Benedictine centers, to Benedictine monasteries. Therefore, scriptoria, centers for the copying and centers for the copying of manuscripts, developed as centers of literacy and scholarship throughout Western Europe. And if we look at a map, for example, of the founding of Benedictine houses throughout Western Europe, we find that they spread quite rapidly and quite far. And so throughout the Middle Ages, they became centers where there were texts, where there were literate people, where there were preserved technological knowledge and reading and schools later on. We'll talk about the Benedictines and other religious orders in our next set of lectures. Last person I want to talk about is a very different character, another canonized person, Saint Isidore of Seville. Now, Saint Isidore was born in the 6th century, lived into the 7th century. He was consecrated as the Bishop of Seville in Visigothic Spain around the year 600. Why is Isidore important to us? Well, he's one of the primary extenders of the Roman encyclopedia tradition. We saw the Roman encyclopedia tradition with Pliny the Elder, most of all. We saw it extended in Cassiodorus's Institutiones. It's extended even more so in the etymologies of St. Isidore of Seville. A large book, certainly one of the most widely distributed, widely read books throughout the Middle Ages. It is heavily dependent upon Pliny. It's dependent upon other Roman popularized works. Again, remember, Isidore did not have access to sophisticated Greek originals of natural philosophical thought. Didn't have it. He only could use what he had, and that was largely Roman encyclopedic or popularized sources. That's what he used to compile his own etymologies. Nowadays, there are literally hundreds of medieval manuscripts of the etymologies. Therefore, that argues that it was very, very widely read. Now, one interesting thing about the etymologies. The etymologies contains material like Pliny, but it's much more variegated. That is, there are these sort of bizarre etymologies that Isidore records, a lot of factual material, but a lot of fictional material or twisted, misunderstood facts. It's a real mishmash in terms of quality. I mention this on the one hand, to tell you something about what this widely read book was like for the Middle Ages. If you were literate, you would have read the etymologies. But also to mention something quite amusing, I think. Any of you who might imagine that the Vatican doesn't have a sense of humor will have that thought corrected when I tell you that, bearing in mind what the etymologies is actually like, it's curious that in the year 2001, Saint Isidore of Seville was officially named patron of the Internet. Interesting thought. Well, in the end, the Latin West was able to hold on to very little of ancient culture, and that included natural philosophy and technology. More was preserved in the East, where Greek was still spoken, but the decline of ancient science was clear there as well, and that was at least inaccessible to the Latin West. In the broad view, the Roman Empire did bequeath some important, in fact invaluable gifts to posterity. The idea of a unified Europe, which is something Europeans are still working on today. The universality of the Latin language meant that communication, once scholarly communication became important again, one was able to travel throughout the domain of the ancient Roman Empire, at least in the Latin West, with a single language. Made things much easier. And the memory of former greatness. Now, we don't often think about the importance of memory, of nostalgia for producing new culture. But as we will see as we go through the Middle Ages, through the various Renaissances, down to the early modern period, this memory of the greatness of ancient culture, particularly of Roman culture, is always in the back of people's minds, and it urges them onwards towards somehow trying to recreate, to recapture at least the greatness of their memory, their nostalgia. Faded, indeed, faded memory of what Roman antiquity was like. We'll see that happen several times in very surprising ways. Specifically in natural philosophy, however, the Latin Middle Ages began with scarcely more than a dozen works on natural philosophy from all of antiquity. It's hard to believe, after I've spent 11 lectures telling you about all the things that the ancient world did, to realize that almost nothing of this was transmitted in its original form to the Latin Middle Ages. What the Latin Middle Ages did get were Roman popularizations, recensions, encyclopedic works. And the rest of Greek antiquity was locked away from them, inaccessible, in the eastern part of the empire, in a language that they could not read. Now, as I conclude this quick survey of the scientific and technological developments in the ancient world, I want us already to start looking forward to the next period of our investigation, and that is the Middle Ages. The next set of 12 lectures will be dominated by one incredibly important cultural development which is absolutely key to understanding the Middle Ages, and something that was almost unknown in the classical world, and that is a central commitment to monotheistic religion. The history of science in the Middle Ages is tightly bound, inextricably bound, inseparable from the history of the two great world monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam. Christianity and Islam, at this point in time, in this year, have adherents which total half of the human population. Extraordinarily important to understand them, to understand the Middle Ages. We saw how the change in the dominant Mediterranean culture from Hellenistic to Roman saw the development of new attitudes towards scientific and technological knowledge, and consequently significant results for the nature and the direction of the history of science and technology in the Roman versus Hellenistic worlds. Well, the same change of culture, but I think far more profound and far-reaching in its effects, occurs from the classical to the medieval world on account of the introduction of monotheistic religion, of Christianity and Islam. People's values, interests changed dramatically. The only differences in this transformation between Hellenistic to Roman and then pagan to Christian or Muslim was that in the second change, there was a clear and unquestionable collapse of stable government and administration, disruption of travel and trade owing to unsafe conditions, and so forth. But the bad situation did not last as long as we are often thought to believe. At one time, we talked about a dark age stretching for 1,000 years from the 5th to the 15th century. But we now know that the Middle Ages developed a vibrant culture, intellectual as well as civil, first in Islam and then in the Latin West. Exciting and fascinating times, part of our shared heritage that are not always appreciated the way I think they should be. But that's what we're going to look at in the next section, the surprising ways of the Middle Ages.